All right, guys, Ivan Turgenev's First Love, Chapter 21. My father used to go riding every day. He had an excellent English mare, a chestnut roan with a long, slender neck and long legs. She was called Electric. No one could ride her except my father. She was a vicious and tireless animal. One day he came in to me. He was in an excellent temper, something which had not happened for a long time. He was dressed for riding and was wearing spurs. I begged him to take me with him. "We'd better have a game of leapfrog," said my father. "You'll never keep up with me on your cob." "Oh, yes, I will. I'll wear spurs, too." "Well, all right." We set off. I was on a black, shaggy, frisky little horse with strong legs. He did, it is true, have to gallop pretty hard when Electric was in full trot, but still we did not lag behind. I've never seen a horseman to equal my father. He looked so fine on his mount, sitting apparently with such effortless ease that the horse itself, as if conscious of it, seemed to take pride in the rider. We rode through all the avenues, visited the Maiden's Field, took several fences. I used to be scared of the jumps, but my father despised timidity, and I ceased to be afraid. Twice we crossed the Moscow River, and I had begun to think that we were going home, particularly as my father had himself noticed that my horse was getting tired, when suddenly he veered away from me at the Crimean Ford and broke into a gallop along the bank. I followed him. Presently he came up to a tall stack of old logs. Here he stopped, leaped nimbly off Electric, ordered me to dismount, gave me his bridle to hold, and telling me to wait for him there. Near the stack, turned into a little side street and disappeared. I began to walk up and down beside the river, leading the horses and scolding Electric, who kept tossing her head and shaking herself, snorting and neighing, and when I stopped would start plowing up the earth with her hooves, or whinnied and bit my cob in the neck. In a word, behaved in every way like the spoilt thoroughbred she was. There was no sign of my father. An unpleasant raw dampness came drifting from the river. A thin drizzle began to fall softly, tracing a crisscross pattern of tiny brown spots on the great timber. I was thoroughly sick of seeing those wretched logs as I wandered up and down beside them. I was becoming more and more deeply depressed, and still my father did not return. A night watchman who looked like some sort of Finn, gray all over, with an enormous helmet like a kettle and a halbert, was a night watchman doing, of all places, on the banks of the Moscow River. Loomed up near me, and turning his face wrinkled like an old woman's toward me, said, "What are you doing here with these horses, sir? I'll hold them for you, shall I?" I did not answer him. He began to beg tobacco from me. In order to get rid of him, moreover, I was consumed with impatience. I took a few steps in the direction in which my father had vanished, walked down to the end of the little street, turned the corner, and stopped. In the street about 40 paces from me, before the open window of a small wooden house with his back to me, stood my father. He was leaning with his chest over the window-sill. Inside the house, half concealed by a curtain, sat a woman in a dark dress, talking with my father. It was Zenaida. I was utterly stunned. This, I admit, I did not expect. My first impulse was to run away. My father will look round, I thought. I shall be lost. But an odd feeling, a feeling stronger than curiosity, stronger even than jealousy, stronger than fear, gripped me. I stood still and looked. I strained my ears to hear. My father seemed to be insisting on something. Zenaida would not consent. Her face is before my eyes now, sad and serious and beautiful, and upon it the imprint, impossible to convey, of grief, devotion, love, and a kind of despair. I could find no other word for it. She spoke in monosyllables without lifting her eyes, and only smiled submissively and stubbornly. By this smile alone I recognized my Zenaida, as she once was. My father gave a shrug of his shoulders and set his hat straight on his head, which with him was always a sign of impatience. Then I could hear the words, "Vous devez vous séparer de cette." Zenaida straightened herself and held out her hand, and something unbelievable took place before my eyes. My father suddenly lifted his riding crop, with which he had been flicking the dust off the folds of his coat, and I heard the sound of a sharp blow struck across her arm, which bared to the elbow. It was all I could do to prevent myself from crying out. Zenaida quivered, looked silently at my father, and raising her arms slowly to her lips, kissed the scar which glowed crimson upon it. My father flung away the crop, and bounding quickly up the steps to the porch, broke into the house. Zenaida turned round, stretched out her arms, tossed her head back, and also moved away from the window. Faint with horror, aghast, almost out of my wits, I turned and ran all the way back down the turning, and almost letting go of Electric. I made my way back to the bank of the river. My thoughts were in a dreadful whirl. I knew that my cold and reserved father was liable to occasional fits of fury, but yet I could not begin to grasp what it was that I had witnessed, and in the same instant I realized that however long I lived, I should always remember Zenaida's particular movement. her look, her smile at that moment. I realized that this image of her, this new image which had so suddenly arisen before me, would live in my memory forever. Unseeingly, I stared at the river, unconscious of the tears which were streaming from my eyes. They are beating her, I thought. Beating, beating. What are you doing? Give me the mare, I heard my father's voice behind me. Mechanically, I gave him the bridle. He leaped on Electric's back. The horse, chilled to the marrow, reared and bounded about 6 feet forward. But my father soon had her under control. He plunged his spurs into her sides and hit her over the neck with his fist. Bah! The whip's gone, he muttered. I remember the swish and the blow of his whip a short while before and shuddered. Where have you put it? I asked my father after a short pause. He did not answer and galloped on. I overtook him. I was determined to see his face. Did you get bored waiting for me? He muttered through his teeth. A little, but where did you drop your whip? I asked him again. He gave me a quick glance. I didn't drop it, he said slowly. I threw it away. He grew pensive and his head fell, and it was then that I saw for the first, and it may be the last, time how much tenderness and passion his stern features could express. He galloped away again, but this time I wasn't able to catch up with him. I arrived home about a quarter of an hour after him. Yes, this is love, I again said to myself as I sat that night at my writing desk on which exercise books and notebooks had begun to make their appearance. This is passion, and yet how could one fail to feel the most furious resentment? How can one bear to be struck by any hand, however dear, and yet it seems one can if one is in love? And I imagine. So I want to highlight that real quick. Yes, this is love. This is passion. During the past month, I had suddenly grown much older, and my love, with all its violent excitements and its torments, now seemed even to me so very puny and childish and trivial, beside that other unknown something which I could hardly begin to guess at, but which struck terror into me like an unfamiliar, beautiful, but awe-inspiring face whose features one strains in vain to discern in the gathering darkness. That night I dreamt a strange and frightening dream. I fancied that I entered a low, dark room. My father was standing there, holding a riding crop in his hand and stamping with his feet. Zenaida was cowering in the corner, and there was a crimson mark, not upon her arm, but upon her forehead. And behind them both rose Lozarov, covered with blood. His pale lips parted, and he made angry, menacing gestures at my father. 2 months later, I entered the university, and 6 months after that, my father died, as a result of a stroke in St. Petersburg, where he had only just moved with my mother and me. Several days before his death, he had received a letter from Moscow, which upset him greatly. He went to beg some sort of favor of my mother, and so, they told me, actually broke down and wept. He, my father, on the morning of the very day on which he had the stroke, he had begun a letter to me, written in French. My son, he wrote, beware of the love of women. Beware of that ecstasy, that slow poison. My mother, after his death, sent a considerable sum of money to Moscow. So what happened right there? Was Zenaida? About her arm? What happened? I gotta Google it. Don't really know. Anyway, so the dad died. It's fucked up, man. It's crazy.